July 22, 1209. Dawn breaks over Béziers, and within hours, 20,000 people will be dead, not from plague, not from famine, but from men who came carrying crosses and singing hymns. This is the story of how God's army burned an entire city alive, slaughtered children in churches, and turned sanctuary into slaughterhouse, all in the name of saving souls. And the worst part? The man who ordered it all wore the robes of a papal legate, spoke Latin prayers before breakfast, and genuinely believed he was doing holy work. Welcome to the Albigensian Crusade, where the Catholic Church discovered that if you can't convert heretics, you can always just kill everyone and let God sort it out later. Southern France in the early 13th century wasn't just a region, it was a problem. At least according to Pope Innocent III, who had bigger issues with French peasants than he ever did with Muslims. The Cathars, or good Christians, as they smugly called themselves, had been spreading through Languedoc like a theological virus. And they had the audacity to suggest that maybe, just maybe, the Catholic Church was full of corrupt, wealthy hypocrites, more interested in gold than God. They rejected materialism, refused to eat meat, believed the physical world was created by Satan. And worst of all, they told people they didn't need priests to talk to God. To the Pope, this wasn't just heresy. It was a business model threatening to put the Church out of work. When Pope Innocent III's legate was murdered in 1208, allegedly by a knight with Cathar sympathies, the Pope had his excuse. He declared a crusade not against distant infidels, but against Christians living just south of Paris. The pitch was simple: kill heretics, take their land, get your sins forgiven. It was ethnic cleansing with a salvation guarantee. By July 1209, an army of northern French nobles, mercenaries, and religious fanatics had assembled somewhere between 10 and 20,000 men who'd been promised paradise if they spent 40 days butchering their southern neighbors. Leading this carnival of sanctified violence was Arnaud Amalric, the abbot of Quito and papal legate, a man so devoted to Christ as message of love that he would personally oversee one of medieval Europe's worst atrocities. Béziers was the first major target, a prosperous city of maybe 14,000 people, most of whom were actually Catholic. But the city had refused to hand over its few hundred Cathar residents, which in Amalric's mind made everyone complicit. The Crusaders set up camp outside the walls, expecting a nice, leisurely siege time to pray, time to loot the countryside, time to write threatening letters. But then something unexpected happened that turned a potential negotiation into a massacre. A group of young idiots from Béziers, perhaps drunk or simply fatally overconfident, burst out of a side gate and attacked some Crusader scouts. It was a minor skirmish, a stupid act of bravado that should have ended with a few corpses and a laugh. Instead, it triggered a rampage. The Crusader army, seeing the gate open and sensing chaos, charged. They didn't bring siege equipment. They didn't bring ladders. They barely brought organization. They just ran at the walls screaming war cries, and the defenders shocked, unprepared, probably still arguing about whether to open the main gates, failed to stop them. Within hours, the Crusaders were inside, and discipline evaporated faster than holy water in hell. This wasn't a battle. It wasn't even a siege. It was a riot with religious justification. The Crusaders, supposedly there to eliminate heresy, couldn't tell a Cathar from a Catholic, even if their eternal souls depended on it, which, according to Amalric, they didn't. When his officers asked how they should distinguish the heretics from the faithful Catholics during the slaughter, Amalric allegedly delivered one of history's most chilling lines: "Sed Dios, evit enim dominus qui sunt eius." Kill them all. God will know his own. Whether he actually said it is debated. Caesarius of Heisterbach recorded it years later, and medieval chroniclers weren't exactly fact-checkers, but it doesn't matter. The Crusaders acted as if he had. They killed everyone. Men were cut down in the streets. Women were raped and butchered. Children were thrown from windows or run through with swords. The elderly, The sick, the pregnant, none of it mattered. Faith didn't matter. Innocence didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was that Béziers had defied the Pope, and now it would serve as a lesson written in blood and ash. Hundreds of people fled into the Church of St. Mary Magdalene, that beautiful Romanesque structure that had stood for generations as a symbol of faith and protection. They packed inside mothers clutching babies, old men praying, priests holding crosses, all believing that surely, a crusader army wouldn't violate sanctuary. They believed wrong. The crusaders surrounded the church, barred the doors, and set it on fire. They burned it with everyone inside. You could hear the screaming from outside the city walls. The smell of burning flesh mixed with incense and melting gold from the altar. Monks tried to intervene and were cut down. Other churches across the city were ransacked, their reliquaries smashed, their manuscripts torn apart, their clergy murdered if they protested. This was a crusade led by churchmen, authorized by the Pope, blessed by bishops, and it turned houses of God into ovens. Amalric later wrote to Pope Innocent III, proudly reporting that almost 20,000 citizens were put to the sword, regardless of age or sex. He celebrated it. He bragged about it. He treated the massacre like a quarterly earnings report to corporate headquarters, except the product being moved was corpses, and the profit margin was measured in souls supposedly saved through slaughter. By nightfall, Béziers wasn't a city anymore. It was a smoking ruin filled with the dead and the dying, a monument to what happens when religious certainty meets medieval brutality. But the Crusaders weren't done. Having killed everyone, they now turned to erasing the city itself. Fires were set systematically throughout Béziers, not as collateral damage, but as deliberate policy. Entire neighborhoods were torched, stone buildings cracked in the heat, timber structures collapsed into ash. Even the cathedral, even the monasteries, even the shrines, all of it burned. The Crusaders weren't just eliminating heresy, they were eliminating memory. They wanted to ensure that Béziers would serve as a warning so terrifying that other cities would surrender immediately rather than risk the same fate. And it worked. As the army marched onward toward Carcassonne, towns began opening their gates without resistance, terrified that they'd be next. The massacre of Béziers accomplished in one day what years of preaching could. It made heresy seem less dangerous than resistance. But let's talk about what this really meant on the ground, because medieval massacres weren't clean Hollywood affairs with quick deaths and dramatic music. They were prolonged, chaotic, and deeply personal. When the Crusaders entered homes, they didn't just kill, they looted first. Families were forced to watch as soldiers rifled through their possessions, stealing jewelry, coins, fine cloth, anything valuable. Then came the violence. Chroniclers mention rape repeatedly, though medieval writers usually understated it, because sexual violence against women was so common it barely registered as noteworthy. Children were killed in front of their parents, sometimes accidentally in the chaos, sometimes deliberately when they wouldn't stop crying. Bodies piled up in the streets faster than they could be cleared, creating obstacles that soldiers had to climb over to continue the killing. Blood ran through the gutters like rainwater, mixing with mud and refuse, creating a stinking slurry that medieval people, already accustomed to filth, found overwhelming. The Garonne River, which ran near the city, reportedly carried corpses downstream for days afterward, swollen bodies bumping against riverbanks and snagging on fishing nets. Survivors who returned weeks later found skeletons in houses, bones in churches, and skulls in wells where people had jumped trying to escape the flames. The psychological aftermath was arguably worse than the physical destruction. The few who escaped, maybe a few hundred people who fled before the Crusaders arrived or hidden in the surrounding countryside, came back to find their entire world erased. Homes gone, families dead, churches destroyed. The social fabric that had held Béziers together for centuries was simply gone, burned away in a single day. Some survivors never spoke again. Others went mad. Many wandered to other cities. Traumatized refugees telling stories so horrible that people assumed they were exaggerating until the Crusader army showed up at their gates too. The Albigensian Crusade would continue for another 20 years, grinding through southern France like a holy war machine. But Béziers remained its defining moment. It was the proof that the Catholic Church, when sufficiently threatened, would murder its own faithful rather than risk losing control. It established a template for religious violence that would echo through the Inquisition, the 30 Years' War, and countless other conflicts where faith became an excuse for atrocity. And here's the darkly comic part. The Crusaders didn't even win in the long run. Sure, they killed thousands of Cathars and destroyed their power base in Languedoc. Sure, they annexed southern France to the northern French crown, fundamentally reshaping European politics. But Catharism as an idea? It survived for another century, driven underground but never completely eliminated. The Church had to invent the Inquisition specifically to root out the remaining believers, creating an entire bureaucracy of torture and terror just to finish what the Albigensian Crusade started. Béziers was burned for nothing, or rather, it was burned because Pope Innocent III and his thugs like Arnaud Amalric decided that ideological purity mattered more than human life. They created martyrs, not converts. They spread terror, not faith. They proved that when you claim to speak for God, you can justify literally anything, even burning churches full of Christians while singing hymns about God's love. The ruins of Béziers stood empty for years after the massacre, a haunted place that locals avoided. Eventually, people trickled back and began rebuilding, but the city never fully recovered its former prosperity or population. The Church of St. Mary Magdalene was reconstructed, though medieval builders apparently decided not to mention in their dedication that it had previously been used as a crematorium for hundreds of Catholics. Arnaud Amalric, meanwhile, continued his career without consequence. He became Archbishop of Narbonne, died peacefully in 1225, and was buried in a monastery he'd founded. No punishment, no regret, no moment of clarity where he looked at the charred remains of Béziers and wondered if maybe, just maybe, he'd taken the whole rooting out heresy thing a bit too far. The Catholic Church never officially condemned the massacre. Innocent III praised Amalric's efficiency. Later, popes cited the Albigensian Crusade as a successful model for dealing with heresy. The lesson they took from Béziers wasn't maybe we shouldn't burn entire cities, but rather intimidation works. So here's your question to ponder. Was the massacre of Béziers driven by genuine religious ideology, or was it political dominance wearing a priest's robes? Was Arnaud Amalric a true believer who thought he was saving souls, or was he just a medieval mob boss eliminating competition for the Church's monopoly on salvation? Could anything have stopped it once those young idiots opened that gate? Or was Béziers doomed the moment the Pope decided that southern France needed a lesson in obedience? Think about it. Because the same logic that burned, Béziers has echoed through history. Whenever someone decides they know God's will so perfectly that murder becomes holy work. Caesarius of Heisterbach recorded Arnaud Amalric's infamous reply, "Kill them all. God will know his own. History remembers, even when mercy does not." And sometimes, history remembers specifically because mercy was never even considered. Just crosses, swords, and the screaming of the faithful burning alive in churches while crusaders sang psalms outside. Sweet dreams.